All right, I think we can probably go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to week 2. The format for today, Seif has adjusted the permissions, so hopefully that will resolve some of the issues that we saw last time. So only hosts should be able to share, and then what we'll do is at the end of the session, we'll open up, we'll make the chat available for the last few minutes and do some Q&A through the chat. So it looks like Anish is here. So Anish is the instructor for today. He's the co-founder, CTO, and Chief Scientist at Panther Protocol. Prior to Panther, he worked on multiple DeFi projects and supported the early Ripple team and was also part of the Ethereum Swarm team. So we're going to hear from him today about classic and modern cryptography. So take it away, Anish.
Hi, everyone. Having cost everybody this amount of nuisance. So let me give you some background, and I'll try, give you a quick summary of what I had in mind. I'm hoping to actually give you like a quick rundown in history from like prehistoric times to modern cryptography. So it won't be in a lot of depth. Some of it is quite personal to me, especially the revitalized Bletchley Park and things of that sort. So I've also added a couple of books in case you're interested. So feel free to read up the books and feel free to ask me questions. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So to start off with cryptography, right? It's a Greek word. And, this is taken straight off Wikipedia. So cryptos means hidden or hidden secret. Graphy means it's like writing. So essentially it's hidden writing. And kind of what this means is like you having the ability to communicate in the presence of adversaries. And this will come handy when we talk about adversarial models. I don't think I'll be going into adversarial models, but it's one of the concepts that you will come across quite a lot when you talk about zero knowledge and things of that sort. Can I please have the next slide, please? Okay, so the storyline about cryptography is something like this. In every time in history, since time immemorial, you had kings or rulers, and there were spies. And both the kings had to communicate to each other securely, and the spies had to communicate with the kings or kingmakers securely, right? And the whole story of cryptography could be thought of as a power struggle. And I'm not going to talk about cypherpunks, and this is something very related and relevant, but I'm not going to talk about it. But those of you who are interested should probably look it up. It's looking at the impact of cryptography in society, and it's a whole movement, right? So let's look at a few ones. One of the things I have there is skytail. So what is skytail? Skytail is a very, very simple mechanism, okay? Imagine I have a long ribbon and I have a stick, and I wrap it up like this and I write something, right? Once I unstrip it, I have a long ribbon. Unless I get the stick, the right stick, right? You can't actually decrypt it, right? This is almost similar to an OTP mechanism, one-time bad. I am not going to talk much about OTP, but I will pass through in that sense. And Caesar had his own set of ciphers, and then it became more and more sophisticated. And the thing that I would probably say is the substitution ciphers and transposition ciphers. Can I have the next slide, please? So the simplest of the mechanism you could think of is like, imagine you had the alphabets written in an outer ring and another set of alphabets written in a different inner ring, and they match to each other. And if you just move them slightly, so you can actually have like A transpose for T in that sense. So if the cipher, if the plain text is A, the cipher text is T, and when you look it up backwards, when you have T in the ciphertext, you get A back. That's kind of what that means. It's a monoalphabetic cipher. Polyalphabetic ciphers is like you take a chunk of alphabets and then you do it. And transpositional ciphers is like very trivial. I shall leave this with you to figure this one out. You probably played this when you were a kid. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so in general, there's what I would say three pieces that you need to recognize in this whole story of cryptography in that sense. There's this mechanism by which you have text, which is called plain text, and you convert that into the ciphertext. That's called encryption. So plain text to ciphertext encryption, and the other way around is called decryption, right? Okay. And then there's two classes of symmetric key cryptography, right? Should have been written the other way around, but it doesn't matter, right? Okay, what is symmetric key cryptography? Symmetric key cryptography essentially means, typically speaking, the key that you use to encrypt and the key that you use to decrypt are pretty much the same, right? So, if you have a plain text and a cipher, the key, and then the encryption mechanism. So essentially, you have a plain text, an encryption mechanism, a key, and you get a ciphertext, right? So this is encryption in that sense. Decryption is like you have the ciphertext, the box which does decryption, which is the algorithm, and you put in the key, and then you pump out the decrypted text or the plain text. Okay. There are two classes of this thing. One is called block cipher. So essentially, when you were to do encryption, you take blocks of this text and you encrypt it, right? Ciphertext is like you take a whole stream and then you encrypt the whole thing, right? Now you might be wondering, is there some rules of the game, how you define adversary and how, what the adversary's powers are. So this is where the Kirchhoff's principle really matters. The Kirchhoff principle implies that, the system should be secure in such a way that everything except the key, when exposed, you should still have security. Okay, this is pretty much what it means. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Right, now I'm going to say something about a bit of history. So I can't see you guys all, so I'm going to do this. So if I have a show of hands, how many of you recognize Zimmerman telegram? Show of hands. I don't know how to show of hands. Is there any mechanism by which you could do that? Right, nobody seems to. Okay, so, oh, okay, there's somebody. Okay, all right. Ahmed, why don't you go ahead? Oh, are they allowed to speak or they're not allowed to speak? Save, Sierra. How does this work?
Sorry, I have to flip back and forth with the slides, so it's hard to get to my mic. They're not able to speak until the last few minutes.
Okay, all right. Oh, that's fine then. Then I'll do this. So, Zimmerman telegram is one of the key events that was key in the start of the World War I, especially U.S. entering the First World War, right? So what has happened is there was one telegram that was sent by the Germans to Mexico, and apparently the British decrypted it and made some changes or published it. We don't know exactly what happened, but in summary, that was key in the whole history, right? So what effectively has happened is, like, over the years in classical cryptanalysis, we could recognize if you just do substitution, substitutional ciphers or things of that sort, you could, especially monoalphabetic substitution ciphers, right? The statistical properties of the language is propagated straight up. Okay, so effectively what this means is, you could recognize what language it is that you are actually encrypting. So if I'm not mistaken, English has an entropy of 0.33. And the second bit is, like, there are other statistical correlations that you have. If you have to take two alphabets, and if you were to predict which alphabet is coming after next, each of the different languages will have a very specific statistical distribution and hence correlation, right? So there's also this possibility that you could actually brute force it. So essentially, you look for all the possibilities and you break it. And you can also do just the ciphertext attack. A ciphertext attack is like, just have a whole bunch of ciphertext, and then doing statistical analysis, you recover the plain text and sometimes the key. Okay, so I just wanted to, phrase the whole thing with Zimmerman's telegram, but that's where we are. Can I have the next slide, please? So the whole story of cryptanalysis goes to the next level when we talk about World War II, right? And in many ways, again, I could be biased, as I said, like there is some influence of Bletchley Park and other things in my, days in grad school. So I might be biased in some sense. But in general, everybody agrees the role that cryptography played was pivotal in World War II, right? It was key for communication, planning, and intelligence, right? And it really drove machines for encryption and decryption, and thus leading to electromechanical computation, computers, and to the modern computer. Okay, can I go to the next slide, please? Right. So on the right side, you have Enigma, and the left side is, or the below is kind of a simplified version. The way you should think about it is there was one guy called Arthur Shrivas. He actually had a patent for this thing. It was a simplified version, just had 3 rotors. And then what they did was they added an extra reflector at the end. And that resulted in the combinatorics being almost doubled. So it was quite interesting in that sense. From a mechanical perspective, it's quite interesting. So if you were to encrypt something the same way as you were describing, you press the button, and then the light that's supposed to be your ciphertext will light up. Okay. Can I have the next slide, please? So why is Bletchley Park super interesting in this sense? I'm sure everybody has heard about Alan Turing and the Turing test, right? Given the age of AI, everybody and his dog has heard about Turing test, okay? So Alan Turing made his career doing cryptanalysis, okay? So those of you who recognize Bletchley Park, this is the building that was left. There was a whole bunch of huts that were around this place that were all, burned down or moved down after World War II was over. And all the work that was actually done in Bletchley Park was classified for a very long period of time, okay? So I didn't mention to you that the cryptanalysis of Enigma did result in, progress in computation. So there's this thing called BOMP, which is actually used to decipher German messages. And the thing I was about to say was the Bletchley Park, which you see right now, if you go there, there was a society that was created to revitalize the whole thing. And one of the people that was closely involved in that is one of my PhD supervisors, Fred Piper. He passed away now. And the other thing I would say is, like, if you're really interested in cryptography from a very introductory perspective, he has a book that he has written. It's incredibly good. It assumes nothing about your mathematical knowledge, but gives you very, very good idea about what is happening. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so the thing that happened in Bletchley Park was the following, right? Initially, whenever these guys used to use Enigma, they would actually have like a bunch of settings for the day and some extra messages, which is like weather and things like that. And this was actually used to decrypt all the Enigma messages. And they had to brute force it. So the brute force initially, the electromechanical compute was actually used. I don't know if you know all the exchanges. So exchanges actually had like a series of things that can actually rotate a 0 to 9 in that sense. It's a mechanical pulse. So Tony Flowers, you probably will mention his name later. He built a massive version of it. Between Alan Turing and Golden Meshman, they actually created this thing that allowed them to decrypt stuff, right? Like instead of humans doing this, they could brute force things really, really fast. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So, Enigma, as I said, it has 3 rotors and actually had like a mirror at the end. So that was the level of complication that it had, or complexity it had. So what had happened is, like, then the German High Command used that even more. So generally speaking, Enigma was used between, say, there's a naval version of the Enigma, right? So on the last of the books, last of the slides, I actually added a slide. So there's a book called Seizing the Enigma. And if anybody's interested in Second World War cryptanalysis, and Enigma really helped the Allies break the Axis you should definitely go read the book. And I have it at the last slide. But in summary, Enigma was actually used for people. So the German army to communicate to his field officers. And when they had to go to the high command, they had a different version. It's called Lawrence. Okay, and this was actually broken by the guys in Bletchley Park. And can I have the next slide, please? Yes. So this is the guy, Tony Flowers. Okay. So I've briefly met him before he passed away, and he was working in Colossus. Now, if anybody goes to Bletchley Park, okay, there are a couple of pieces you can possibly pick up. One is like a fake version of Enigma machine. It's an electronic version. So you press a button and I think LED lights up. It's sold as a kit. You can buy them. And the thing about Colossus is one of the first programmable electronic digital computer. Okay, and it really helped them decrypt Lawrence, right? So this is like the first of the what I call possibly one of the first digital computers globally, right? And then ENIAC happened and all those things. But this didn't, all of this wasn't revealed to the public for a very long period of time. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to switch gears from the Second World War to when people were given access to cryptography. Okay, so I should probably caveat this with something. The caveat I need to put in is the following. So for a very long period in time, there was very strict regulation. Even now, there's strict regulation on export of cryptography. Okay, so the thing is, like in the US, export of cryptographic libraries are considered similar to export of munitions. So there's an agreement called Wassenaar Agreement, and that prevents this from happening. So between Second World War until deaths happened, military and other nation states always had access to cryptography, as in like much better cryptography, as the story of deaths will actually tell you, right? But civilians didn't have one. So what had happened in the 70s, there was a standard that was proposed, right? A symmetry key standard. And the thing was like, the storyline is something along those lines. So IBM proposed this in 1970s. It goes through a whole bunch of things. Can I have the next slide, please? So the initial version that was there was pretty much a, how could I say, 128-bit encryption. So it goes to NIST. NIST comes back, and then effectively they reduce the key size to 56 bits. 8 bits is checksum. So it takes 64-bit blocks with 56-bit key strength. Okay, and they have the construct called Fiestal ciphers, which is like, I have a short description of that on the next slide. But in summary, it's like IBM in the 1970s, they actually create a new cipher. And initially, the proposal was 128 bits, but it goes to NIST. NIST gives some feedback. So when it comes back, the key length is reduced to 56. Okay, and then, okay, right. Somebody's asking me these things. So it goes down to 66 bits, and out of the 64-bit, and then it has a 64-bit block, right? And it's 16 rounds of Fiestal ciphers. Can I have the next slide, please? Right. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. It's more or less like you have two halves, and you do the operation on either half. And there's this thing called S-box, which is like a lookup table. And every time you finish a round, you swap the left for the right and right for the left. Okay, that's what it does. Okay, next one, please. Right. Okay, so I kind of mentioned this already, right? So the assumption here is like, okay, when it was introduced, it was probably secure, but 56 bits was pretty poor, right? And you could even do brute force analysis, which is like literally go through all the possible set of keys, and you could get the possible key out, right? And it will be clear to you by the next slide. Can I have the next slide, please? So there are two cryptanalytical attacks that happen. And again, there is some historical context to that. And I need to describe this so you get this. So when the initial Lucifer was created and it was actually sent from IBM to Nest, they gave some feedback on a bunch of Xboxes. And in 1989, when Eli Benham and Adi Shamir actually did the initial cryptanalysis, which is in 1989, if I'm not mistaken, they found a bunch of possible ways to decrypt two related text in that sense. Okay, and so the real surprise was a set of S boxes that NIST suggested they should use. They seem to be pretty resistant to differential cryptanalysis. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So then, that kind of tells you that there is always this advantage between nation states and an average person on the street. The nation state knows about the existence of differential cryptanalysis even before people on the street knew, which is like in the 1970s. If we are going to be a bit, what do I call, cynical, right? In the 1970s, NIST stroke NSA knew about differential cryptanalysis, whereas differential cryptanalysis only was known to public in 1989. Okay, so then there was linear cryptanalysis. Okay, this is Matsui. So it analyzes relationship between plain text, ciphertext, and key bits. Okay, and it requires a lot more text. So 2 to the power 43 was differential cryptanalysis, if I'm remembering top of my head. 2 to the power 48, 47 and 48 is a linear cryptanalysis. Can I have the next slide, please? So now the thing was, okay, given it's just 56 bits key space, can you actually brute force it, right? So first, there was like a massive distributed project which was trying to cryptanalyze it, and one what EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation. So those of you don't know what Electronic Frontier Foundation, it's a very interesting bunch of people. They were interested in kind of influenced by the cypherpunk philosophy, very much defenders of first principles in the US, providing support for cryptographers who get sued by various agencies, right? They also do cryptanalysis and other things. So what had happened is like they actually created a massive desk cracking machine, and they just cracked it in 3 days. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so now let's change gears and kind of switch from block ciphers to hash function, right? So hash function has it's a simple mechanism. So effectively, you take in something, you provide an output. The output proves to you that at some point in time you had access to the input. So if you were from parts of the world like India, if you were to have a roti, you know for a fact at some point in time you had some dough available to you. So you convert the dough into something circular and heat it up, and then you have a roti, whatever shape that is, right? So it's a one-way function. No point in time, and this is why I normally describe these things this way, right? No point in time can you actually convert a roti back into dough. It's a one-way function, okay? So can I have the next slide, please? So, before this, I was talking a lot about block ciphers. And now you might be wondering, can you actually do a block cipher into hash function? So, it is possible. I'm proposing, and I kind of put in like 3 different mechanisms to do this. But in summary, what you can do is like you can always think of a block cipher as a hash function, because property-wise, in a complexity theoretic sense, it's a pseudo-random number function. As in, like, if a block cipher is working the way you define in information theoretic sense with certain properties, it should behave in the same way as you replace with the hash function. Okay. All right. Can I have the next slide, please? So, okay, there are 3 things that, actually there are 2 things that you're super interested in, right? That one, both of them that I explained using the dough example, right? One wayness is the most important thing, right? So, you have a dough, you convert it into a shape, and then you cook it, and now you have a roti. or whatever that is. Or you get an egg, make an omelet, right? Once you have an omelet, no way in hell are you going to convert that back into an egg. That's one wayness, right? Collision free essentially means like if you have different kinds of eggs, right? And you make different omelets, right? So every omelet, once the process is agreed, once you put in the one egg, the omelet that comes on the other end is unique, right? No two eggs can produce the same omelet. That's what collision free means. This is constructive puzzle friendliness. This is an arbitrary thing in one sense of speaking. It's more for the people in the so-called crypto world. I mean crypto as in like Web3, right? So, what it means is like it can be computed efficiently in some sense of speaking. So this is like a very tricky one. Of the people who have been around for a while, if you have been familiar with Equihash, you know what happens, right? So I won't go into detail. So the story of Equihash is like Ethereum had a hash function which was, trying to do something which wouldn't allow ASICs to really accelerate it. But what happened is GPUs really accelerated it, and at some point in time, ASICs were available that could actually do it. So it had a high I/O input-output requirement, which was pretty expensive to implement in ASICs, but people worked around it. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Right. Okay, so I think this is pretty trivial, right? I'm kind of describing what collision resistance means, right? As I said before, like if you have two eggs, if and only if both eggs are identical, you will have the omelet, which is the same. End of story. Next slide, please. Right. Okay. So, I think I'll try and describe this in very simple sense, right? So the way you can think about this is, I'm sure you've heard about this, that, if you have enough monkeys on a keyboard, you can get Shakespeare, right? The same thing applies here. You apply enough of randomness at point in time, you would actually have collisions, right? It has to happen. Like effectively what this means in monkeys and Shakespeare, a genius, obviously. Again, there's controversies about authorship of Shakespeare, but let's ignore it. Let's assume him to be genius and monkeys as not geniuses. And the intersection, the collision happens at some point in time. It might take very, very long periods of time, but that's theoretically what it means. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Right. Okay, so this is like a question, rhetorical one, and the answer is no, right? There is no way in hell that a hash function could be collision free, because you're really reducing a very, very, very large number to a small number. So when you do that, a domain to a range, they will always be wrapping around, right? I mean, you'll make more sense of it when I talk about abelian fields and finite fields. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so what is it really useful for? Okay, the usefulness is quite important. So usefulness is essentially mapping random anything to something that's unique. That's where this thing is. Imagine you have a block of text and you want to have a hash, which will be much, much smaller than the size of the block of text, right? And that will be unique. And it's very hard to actually, just looking at the block of text is impossible, as in like the hash. It's impossible to reverse it into the block of text, right? But this is the key, right? And in general, hashes are small, right? Can I have the next slide, please? Right. Okay. So yeah. Okay. One way, and I think I've already. Forgive me for this. Right. Ignore this slide. Next slide, please. Right. Okay. So the other bit that is going to be useful, and this is more useful for all of us. When you're going to look at zero knowledge, one of the things you will always hear is commitment, right? So what does commitment mean? Commitment mean is like you have a message, you use a hash function, you get a result. Now, given all the things I said, okay? Number one, right? One wayness. What does it mean? Knowing the committed bets, you're unable to make sure what the commitment is. But once the commitment is revealed, you can then check whether the commitment was true or not, okay? It's called bit commitment. So essentially what happens is somebody says, okay, I'm going to bet. Say, take the example of US elections, right? You're going to bet who's going to win. Say you're going to say Harris is going to win. I bet $1,000 that, imagine me, I take a bet with Safe. Safe lives in the US. So I'm going to say, Safe. I'm going to bet $1,000. safe. I'm joking. Okay, I'm not going to give you money. So I'm gonna bet $1,000 that Harris is going to win, right? And then says, Sahib, prove it. So okay, commit to it, right? So I provide the hash function, right? There are ways to do this with smart contracts and essentially uses the same mechanism, but I'm just giving the example, right? Now Safe has my hash function, right? And now when what's her name, Harris, wins the election, literally what happens is like, you put in the text. So he has access to the hash function and the commitment, right? You just need to get the text. When the text is given, you put it through the process, then it should absolutely meet the previous result. If both of them are true, then it's valid. This is what commitment means. Okay, does it make sense? Can I have the next slide, please? Right, and I think the most interesting piece that's there is like a hash pointer, right? Like, so effectively you can think of this as like, okay, you have some information, you use a hash, and the hash actually points to the address to which it actually points. And can I have the next slide, please? And this result in what we call the Merkle tree. And this is the basis of what we call the blockchain, right? So essentially, typically speaking, this tree would, in a binary sense, would actually have at the bottom of the tree leaves, which will be text blocks, and then you take hashes, and those hashes become the first two of them will be combined to the next block. The next two of them will be combined to the next block, and once you have like 3 layers, so 2 to the power n to the power, sorry, 2 to the power n in that sense, right? Blockwise, right? So 3 layers, that's like 8 leaves, right? That's how it would be. So depending on however many leaves you have, right? The number of, if it's a binary tree, so the 2 to the power n, and you know what the n is, right? Okay. So next one, please. Right. So the simplest way to describe the advantages of actually having a Merkle tree is the following, right? Whenever you want to verify something, it's easy to verify. Let's ignore complexity. Okay, so there is this construct. When you are really bored, you can read up of big O notation. It actually kind of measures how much time it takes for you to measure something. There are different kind of complexities. Time, that's the trade-off between space. So essentially, is how much can you store versus how much time it takes for you to compute, right? So this is the thing. Okay. So can I go to the next slide, please? So now I'm going to change that and give you some interesting insights to what has happened with hash functions and why you should care about hash functions, right? So most of the hash functions, the ND series was found by Rivest, okay? So if you have heard about RSA, Rivest Shamir Alderman, the public key cryptography mechanism, which actually uses integer factorization as the trapdoor one, he is one of the people involved in it. Okay, so what happens here is like he creates a series of hash functions because everybody needs hash functions. He creates them. So 93, 2 people find some limited pseudo collisions, and there's this guy called Dan Dobertin, right? He completely does the compression function. And in 2004, I don't know why it took so much long. There's like an MD5 crack distributed cracking thing was launched. And as soon as this was launched, a bunch of Chinese cryptographers published a paper clearly seeing a complete and utter break. Now, if you're cynical and you have conspiracy theories, that will be interesting, but I shall leave it to you, right? Can I have the next slide, please? So now I'm going to explain something to you. So it gives you some notion of what the real security of a hash function is. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to the construct of birthday paradox, okay? So birthday paradox is the probability that given a random set of people, 2 people have the same birthday, right? So you could actually have like a 100% assurance that if you have 367 people, you'll have a collision. But with the probability of 0.5, you can have it with much lesser people. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is where the probability comes in. It's Taylor's equation. You can go have a look at it. But the real key interesting fact is, if you have just 23 people, you can get, okay, a probability of 0.5. So essentially what that means is, when you have 23 people, just 23 people, in a room, you have a collision. So you can always think of, birth as a hash function. Two parties interact, it results in a one-way function. The one-way function results in somebody coming out, right? Yes, it could be biological or whatever process. It doesn't matter, IVF, whatever it is, right? In vitro or organic, but the end result is the same. So think of a random function happening in both sides. A collision of that is like the key space of this random function is 365 days, 366, if you were to take leap years. Okay. Does that make sense to everybody? So essentially, a year has 365 days. Leap year has 366 days. So that's the so-called key space of the hash function. And square root of that 365, 366 is 23, right? And that's the probability which we can actually find a collision with a probability of half. And this applies to any hash function. Can I have the next slide, please? Right, I'm completely changing gears. I'm going to go into public key cryptography. And this bit of the cryptography is again going to be of a lot of interest for everybody who is here. You're going to talk about elliptic curves, and these curves are a bit weird. My recommendation is try not to get too deep into the math of elliptic curves. You might lose all your hair, irrespective of how much hair you have, and you will come out of the other end with very little hair, right? So I will summarize some of it for you. So it's kind of easy. So you will understand the basic parameters in that sense. So Victor Miller and Neil Koblitz were the people who actually came up with this thing. So a given, given security in terms of key length, the security that RSA and DSA has higher than RSA. So RSA is reverse Shamir-Alterman. Given a very large number n, find the two prime factors p and q. So that's ED congruent to p minus p. Okay, I can't remember exactly what it was. There's a direct relationship between the two that actually once it's broken, you can actually find E and D. That's what it means, right? In DSA, effectively what this means is in a very simple sense. If you were to think of Diffie-Hellman kind of thing, so effectively you can have a generator of the group G, some modulus n, and some point that's multiplied by n times. That result, it gives you x, right? So given x, can you find n is a kind of question that you're asking. That's a discrete problem from an elliptic curve perspective. I have it in the next coming slides, okay? So what's the real benefit of actually having elliptic curves? Elliptic curves were kind of, at that point in time, faster to compute, less storage space, and kind of ideal for constrained environments instead of RSA. But for some reason, which I don't know how it happened, Satoshi actually took elliptic curve as a possibility. So just so that you know, most of the browsers support elliptic curves to a very limited extent, right? So initially what we had is the public cryptography because PKCS. So PKCS 1, 1.5, 2, then 7, 12, all of them, right? And there's one PKCS standard called PKCS 13. This is the standard that supports elliptic curves. So generally speaking, you don't see PKCS 13. Can I have the next slide, please? Right. So I'm going to say something. Ignore the thing completely. Remember, I told you, if you want to really keep your hair, ignore this slide and the next slide. I just want to say this for completeness. There's this group called abelian groups. Okay, the storyline is there's this, very, very brilliant, how could I say, very young mathematician who invented all those things. It kind of explains how you do multiply things and all of. So in summary, just assume that there are certain groups with certain characteristics that are very interesting for elliptic curves. So that's abelian field, okay? They have some closure properties. Can I have the next slide, please? So finite field is like another thing that you really need to know in one sense of speaking when you look for points in elliptic curve and things of that sort. Again, when you have time, have a look. I am not going to go into details. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to come to the next topic in terms of elliptic curves and a bit more close. So if you think about like a circle, you can think of an ellipsis in one sense of speaking. X squared plus y squared equals r squared. That's the equation of a circle, right? So in this, you have a y squared equals s cubed plus 7 over fp, right? Of finite field p, right? That's the shape of the thing. Why the shape of this thing is interesting, you'll understand very soon when we do point additions. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is a curve where equation s cubed plus x cubed, y equals s cubed plus ax plus b, right? And you have 3 points, p, q, and r. And this is a very interesting property, and this is very interesting and very useful. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is the magical trick. Okay, this is actually a curve, x cubed minus 3x plus 5, but in summary, it's the same thing. So you draw a line connecting P and Q, and when the line meets the curve, elliptic curve, the point you have there, that's minus R, where R equals P plus Q. So effectively what you do is you draw, this is a geometric method of finding a point of the curve, like addition of points on a curve. So you have P and Q on a curve, you connect a line connecting P and Q, the point connecting P and Q meets the curve at a point minus R, and when you reflect that R on X, you will get R, which is the sum of P and Q. Okay, so this is how you geometrically add 2 points on a curve. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, it doesn't matter. Can I have the next slide as well? Okay, why is this thing more interesting in some sense, in this sense? So imagine you want to add a point on its own, right? So I described the way you would do this when you have P and Q, right? Instead of this, I only have one P, and I actually want to add P to itself. So what do? I do a P, I draw a line, I draw a tangent at a point, and then do reflection, and do this process that I did for P and Q multiple times. So when I do this multiple times, I can go to 2 plus 2. Okay, so if you look at the first one, it goes draw a tangent, it goes and it's the curve, it's minus 2g. I reflect that on X, I get 2g. I connect 2g, draw a tangent on minus 2g, it hits the curve, that's minus 4g. Reflect on X, I get plus 4g, right? Then I draw a tangent, it hits the curve, it's minus 8g. I then reflect on X, that's 8g. Okay, so essentially what did I do? So 2 plus 2, or 2 raised to 2, right? This point. Now I did it twice, so 2 to the power 3 times the point. I got a result, right? So this is the thing. So at any point in time, I could randomly show you a point on the curve and ask you, given the generator G, how many times has this bounced around? This is the elliptical discrete log problem. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, I am going to actually ignore this slide. Can I have the next one? Right, so kind of interesting bit. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible because I really don't want to make it any complicated. So a lot of the cryptography that we have, in some sense, in my head, overhang from Bitcoin. So Bitcoin resulted in a whole bunch of standards. Ethereum, which came after it, somehow accepted them as being a norm, and then it resulted in we all ending up using it, right? So I have a book at the end of the slide. which is called Handbook of Elliptic Curve Cryptography. Sorry, Handbook of Applied Cryptography. So in fact, one of the people who's involved in elliptic curve cryptography, Meneses, is one of the editors of this. Scott Vanstone and Meneses. That's the three people that are involved. So the summary is like there is a a signature scheme that actually uses elliptic curves, and you can sign, and then somebody else can verify that the signature that's been created is yours. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Well, a simple description, right? You have some text, right? And you have your private key, you do an operation, you have a signed message. So somebody gets a signed message, they look at the public key, they can verify that actually it's being created by you. You used your private key to sign this, they can verify with your public key. So it's the inverse of what RSA would do in that sense for encryption, right? So for encryption, you actually use E to encrypt, D to decrypt. So that's why it would be in a signature scheme. It's the other way around. You encrypt with your private key, and everybody verifies that with your public key. So in a public key environment, everybody has two keys. One is private, which is only known to you. The other one is public, and everybody is listed by your public key in that sense. And funny thing is, as I was saying, everything that happened in crypto is kind of attached to, the overhang of Bitcoin. Bitcoin used this public key derivation mechanism, and that resulted in public key addresses. And, the result of that is like we still have some key address mechanisms that still exist in Ethereum and other ones with all of this. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? I am not sure if I should go a lot into detail, but in summary, it kind of gives you a reasonable understanding of how you do ECDSA. So the thing with ECDSA is like a lot of the things that we tend to do, we end up using ECDSAs. But I'm not going to go into details right now. Next slide, please. Right. I'm going to give you some notions of security. This, again, goes back to the general thesis or general paradigm that I've been following in this whole series of talk, effectively describing, classic ciphers, describing to you what cryptanalysis to that looks like, talk to you about block ciphers, give you a notion of cryptanalysis of block ciphers, talk to you about hash functions, give you a notion of weakness of hash functions. Now I'm talking about elliptic curves, and there is some, how could I say, what do I call challenges with using elliptic curves, right? So for people who actually are interested in understanding a bit of pairing, they might be really interested in Vitalik's one. So there's also this operation between groups that's actually used in zero knowledge proof systems. So if you really are interested in zero knowledge proof systems, you probably want to understand a bit more about elliptic curves and pairing. Okay, and I would recommend Vitalik's blog post. Can I have the next slide, please? Right. Okay. So I have to say this again. Whenever you actually have like a elliptic curve that's being published, elliptic curves are very, very hard to verify where there is really sure that the curves are really secure, right? So there's this paper that was published, which I have here, with Dan Bernstein and a bunch of people describing how to actually attack, various elliptic curve standards. So if you were to really look for implementing something, be very aware of the fact that taking a random elliptic curve is not the smartest of ideas. Can I have the next slide, please? So there are a bunch of curves that are publicly known, right? So these are very good places to start. Again, be very warned. NIST actually put out a guidance saying you shouldn't use any elliptic curves, but we still use elliptic curves. We use elliptic curves for Bitcoin. We use elliptic curves for Ethereum. We use elliptic curves for Cosmos. We use elliptic curves for most of the other ones. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So let's try to understand what security of typical elliptic curves mean. So there are like at least 3 classes of, I kind of don't have an index calculus method. So Polatro, MOV, GHS. So which is a very recent one, right? They're like a well-known attacks that are there. And what happens is like it gives you like a pretty good idea of how much of effort in terms of complexity wise, right? To break something, given n bits of length in that sense, right? And that's what's being shown. So if you were to think about this, it's like a running time for most of these things is quite high. It's non-linear, right? So almost NP, right? So when you increase the key length, the time it takes for you to actually brute force it increases non-linearly. So if your key length is 5 and you increase the key length to 10, it's not going to be like just twice, but it will be 10 times, right? It is quadratic. So non-linear essentially means number, not a linear one. It could be like a quadratic or exponential for that matter, right? Okay. Can I have the next slide, please? Right. I kind of mentioned this to you, like, it's an interesting trick. If you could actually derive something into some address, you could actually come up with this new way to represent people. So if anybody has a wallet, this is the trick that we use. We actually have your public key derived. There is a derivation technique and a bunch of standards available. Both Bitcoin and Ethereum has its own standards. That's why the formatting of that is different. And depending upon different standards and different curves and other things, the addresses for these things vary as well. Okay. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, well, so I'm kind of describing how to create a new, key in that sense. This is very trivial. You probably do this whenever you actually initialize your MetaMask, right? So whenever you say, okay, you do something, you get a address, and in the background, you actually have a private key and a public key. The private key stays inside the store, and a public key is available, right? Because the public key is then mapped onto an address, and that address is visible for everybody. Okay, next one, please. Right. So yeah, this is kind of what I was describing all along, which is like, okay, I've described a whole bunch of things, and most of the cryptographic techniques I kind of described are the basis for what you're going to use. So, you will end up using replicas without a shadow of a doubt. You will end up using hash functions without a shadow of a doubt. You will end up using sometimes symmetric key primitives, not always, but these are the basics, building blocks of whatever you have in cryptography. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, don't worry. It's just me trying to show you how to derive this. It's like ridiculous. It doesn't matter. But in summary, you can. Okay, sorry. Can I have the next slide, please? So for the people who are really interested in understanding the history of NSA, okay, I would really recommend Puzzle Palace. So the people who really want to understand the story or really try your hand in doing classical cryptanalysis, I would say Haynes, there's a Dover book, small book, very few pages, pretty interesting. Can I have the next slide, please? And so I talked about Enigma and Colossus. So the book that you need to read, very interesting book. You could probably read this as your bedtime read, Seizing the Enigma, pretty interesting. Colossus, however, is slightly a bit mathematical, but it's definitely worth the read if you really want it. And can I have a next slide, please? So for everybody who really has tolerated all of this until now, plug from me for my supervisor, who is gonna pass away now. It's like the introduction, very short introduction to cryptography. Pretty good. It was by Fred and Sean Murphy. Sean is one of Fred's PhD students. This book is very light. No mathematical maturity is assumed. Pretty good. And remember, I was telling you, whenever you want to build a scheme, you want to have this hack. as handy. That's Alpha-Meneses, Holohot, and Scorpion Stone. Excuse me. And you can download most of it. It's publicly visible. You can download it, and you can read each of the chapters worth a read. So I think I'm done. Next slide. Yeah, that's me. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to try answer them.
Okay. Thank you, Anish. I think if we can take maybe like 10 minutes or so for some questions, if you have time.
Sure. Yeah, we can do that.
Let's see, I think, yeah, if we want to, everybody should be able to send messages in the chat now, I believe. So if you want to just go ahead and put any questions in there, and then I can read them off for Anish. I'll just give a couple minutes here to see if anyone has anything.
Maybe just get a perspective of Anish on this question, which we hear a lot from engineers, is how much cryptography they should learn if they want to sort of like start building on zk and program on zk specifically.
I would say work backwards. Okay, take a library. So what has actually happened is there's so much abstraction that has happened. So if you were to do something, you'll have something like tooling like zkMonk or other things, right? So effectively, you will be shielded from a lot of those things. So you only should learn what you need to learn, but working backwards. Try get a library, try get a tooling, try to implement something. See what is it that you don't know, right? And try learn all the bits that you don't know just enough so that you understand what you're doing. And try not to implement new schemes. That's the most important thing. As in, like, if you take Groth 16 and implement Groth 16, you will have very clear guidelines from everybody who has actually done this with libraries to write this thing, code to check, everything else. So if you want to run the setup, there's already somebody having a Docker instance which you can stand up and run. So that would be my suggestion to everybody, because it's like the other way around. It's non-trivial.
It looks like we had one question come in.
Sure.
Not super specific, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about Bletchley Park or anything else around that.
Okay, sure. I can give you a bit of a history. So Bletchley Park is in Bletchley. It's an obvious one. It's probably how far away? I've only taken a train, so I don't know how far away it's from London. So it's not too far away. And the thing was, like, there was a bunch of huts that were created, and all the cryptographers were actually not really cryptographers. What they did was they ran a bunch of puzzles, and people who were able to solve that, they were all brought to Bletchley Park, and they were all put into groups, and they started doing cryptanalysis of the German, cipher system. So they started with Enigma, and they built. Initially, they were just doing by hand. Then they actually created BOMP, and then they actually created clauses, right? So effectively, that's the basis. So if you have ever heard about Alan Turing, so that guy was the guy who was running the whole thing, and there are some very good books about it. My comment to you would be, like, if you ever come to UK, if you are interested in cryptography, the bit that you're missing the most is Bletchley Park. Go there, get a ticket, go there, walk around, see the whole thing, buy a copy of an Enigma, which is like there's a copy, electronic copy in that sense. There's a bunch of cardboard cutouts and electronic thing, and then a switches and a battery. You put it in, that will almost work like an Enigma, right? So it's really the place where cryptanalysis really, first steps of organized cryptanalysis in Second World War happened. That's what I would say. That's the home ground of modern day computing. So even though von Neumann architecture has evolved and actually got to wherever it got to, the initial electromechanical electronic computation really happened in Bletchley Park. Okay, I hope that gave you some idea.
Looks like we have one other question. Can you talk about the different use cases for algamo cryptography and elliptic curve cryptography, their advantages and which is more in use?
So, okay. So there were like a couple of public key cryptography schemes that came out. Algamo is a discrete log based public key crypto system. So you have, so I kind of only focused on the elliptic curve bit. So yeah, the way I would describe it is like, think of the discrete log problem. The equivalent of that in the elliptic curve world is elliptic curve discrete log problem. So kind of like, given g raised to x mod p equals n, the thing is like how to find n, right? Which is essentially in a normal discrete log problem sense. In an elliptical discrete log problem sense, I walked you through the whole thing, which is essentially p, q, and r, and which is like p, q giving minus r, and you reflect it and get an r. And effectively, if it's just g, and you have a tangent at g meeting the curve, and that gives you minus 2g, and you reflect that. So whatever be the point at any point in time, how do you actually find, given the generator of the group, how many times have it bounced around? These are the two different things, right? So you can actually use elliptic curve discrete problem to actually have like different kind of schemes. The simple scheme is a Diffie-Hellman scheme. Algamo is like a, what do I call it? It's the discrete log problem based scheme. I can't think of anything other than the fact that the size of the key and size of the text is quite high. So you generally don't use algamo.
Awesome. I don't see anything else coming through. I think if anyone else has more questions, always feel free to leave them in the Discord. We can pass them along and answer them for you throughout the week. So thank you so much, Anish.